The quiet town of Meadowville had always been a place where life moved slowly, nestled between rolling hills and tranquil rivers. It was a community where everyone knew each other, where greetings were exchanged at the corner cafe, and where the greatest excitement of the week was the Saturday farmers market. But beneath its serene appearance, Meadowville had its share of unspoken tensions, the kind that simmered just below the surface, waiting for a moment to erupt. Mary Walker was a woman of immense stature, not only in physical presence, but also in her role as the town mayor. Having grown up in Meadowville, she had dedicated her life to working tirelessly to improve the lives of its residents. Her career had been one of justice and progress, fighting against inequality and standing firm for those who felt invisible. And yet, on that warm summer morning, as she tied her sneakers for her daily jog, she had no idea that this day would mark a turning point in her life and in the town's history. Mary had always found comfort in her early morning runs. It was a time to clear her mind, plan her day, and occasionally stop to chat with a few locals. Today she was preparing for a meeting with several business owners about improving infrastructure in the town square. As she jogged along the familiar streets, her mind was already formulating ideas and strategies to make the town more inclusive and efficient. She had just crossed one of the quietest intersections, where the morning sun cast long shadows on the road, when she heard the unmistakable sound of a police siren. It was not a sound that often surprised Mary. After all, as mayor, she worked closely with law enforcement, ensuring they maintained high standards of integrity. But something in the sudden screech of the car behind her sent a wave of unease through her being. "Hey, you stop!" The voice was sharp, authoritative, and laden with weight. Mary slowed her pace, turning to see a white police officer stepping out of his patrol car, his hand resting on the barrel of his holstered weapon. His face was set in a severe frown, his blue eyes scanning her from head to toe with an expression that made her feel more like prey than a citizen. Confused but composed, Mary removed her earbuds. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly, yet firmly. It was the tone she often used in negotiations and council meetings. "You were crossing against the light back there," said the officer accusingly. "I am going to need to see some identification." Mary blinked, momentarily taken aback. She was sure she had not broken any laws. She was meticulous about obeying traffic signals, especially during her runs. The intersection had been clear, the light green when she crossed. "This must be a misunderstanding, surely. I believe I had the right-of-way," she said, maintaining composure. "But if there has been a mistake, I can clarify it. I am on my way to a meeting." "Officer, I do not care where you are going," he interrupted, his tone growing more aggressive. "I said I need to see some identification now." Mary felt a knot tighten in her chest. This was not a simple request, it was a demand rooted in something more than a mere traffic violation. The officer's tone and the way he looked at her made it clear that this was not just about crossing the street. She had faced subtle racism before, but this felt different, more threatening. Even so, she was not one to give in easily. "Officer, I am Mayor Mary Walker. If you check your records, you will see I have not committed any crime. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a meeting to attend," she said firmly, holding her ground. The officer's eyes narrowed, disgust and anger gleaming in his gaze. "Mayor," he scoffed, stepping closer, "I do not care who you think you are. You are not above the law. Now either you show me some identification, or I will arrest you for resisting an officer." A small crowd began to gather, their morning routines interrupted by the unfolding spectacle. People whispered to each other, some taking out their phones to record the scene. Mary could feel their eyes on her, could hear the murmurs of disbelief. Some knew who she was, others were probably visitors or newcomers. But the officer seemed oblivious to the growing attention, focused solely on asserting his authority. "I am the law here," said the officer coldly, reaching for his handcuffs, "and right now you are under arrest." Mary felt a surge of anger well up inside her. This was absurd. She was the mayor of this town, a woman who had devoted her life to its development, and here she was being treated like a common criminal, not for any real wrongdoing, but simply for being a black woman in front of a white officer with a superiority complex. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling within her. This was not just about her. It was about every person of color who had ever been unjustly accused, about every woman who had ever been belittled by a man in power. "I am not leaving," said Mary firmly, holding her position, "and I will not allow you to humiliate me or anyone else in this town because of your prejudice." The officer's face darkened, his grip on the handcuffs tightening. "You can come quietly, or I will make you pay," he said. The crowd gasped, and someone shouted, She is the mayor, you cannot do this." But the officer was not listening. His world had narrowed down to the badge on his chest and the belief that it gave him the right to do whatever he pleased. Mary's heart pounded as she felt the cold metal of the cuffs tighten around her wrists. That once peaceful morning had turned into a nightmare, and as the crowd grew, so did the tension. She could perceive the injustice floating in the air, aware that this was only the start of a much larger battle than herself. The cameras were recording, the group of onlookers growing, and Marie Walker, the mayor of Meadowville, was about to fight not only for her dignity, but also for justice in a system that had failed so many before her. The approaching storm. The metallic click of the handcuffs reverberated in the morning air, a sinister sound that silenced the murmurs of the growing crowd. Marie Walker, her wrists tightly bound behind her back, stood tall and defiant despite the cold steel against her skin. The police officer, whose badge read Officer Kirkland, wore a smug grin as he pushed her towards his squad car, seemingly indifferent to the voices rising around them. But Marie knew this was no ordinary arrest. The tension filling the air was not just about her, but about something much deeper, something that had been festering in this town for years. Meadowville seemed picturesque and peaceful, but beneath that facade lurked racial, social, and economic divisions that individuals like Officer Kirkland had long exploited. The crowd continued to grow, drawn by the shocking image of their mayor in handcuffs. Some onlookers were astonished, others paralyzed by disbelief, and many were already lifting their phones to record the scene. The once quiet street now buzzed with murmurs, indignant voices, confused voices, voices demanding explanations. "What is happening?" asked a man in his 40s, pushing his way through. "That is the mayor, you cannot do this." But Kirkland did not care. He was immersed in the sense of power bestowed by his badge. Marie's identity, her reputation, her work for the community, all were irrelevant to him. In his eyes, she was simply a black woman daring to challenge his authority, and that was enough to consider her a threat. "Everyone back," barked Kirkland, waving his hand dismissively at the crowd. "This is official police business." But the crowd did not back down. They knew Marie. She had grown up in that town and helped shape it into what it was. She was not a criminal. She was their leader, their advocate. The initial disbelief quickly turned into indignation. Marie felt their support, but also knew she had to keep her composure. An emotional outburst could worsen the situation. She had faced adversity before, though never like this. The humiliation burned, but her determination was stronger. "Kirkland," said Marie, her voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, "this is a mistake. You know who I am. Let me go, and we can resolve this peacefully. You are causing a scandal for no reason." Kirkland's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Do not tell me how to do my job, ma'am. Just because you are the mayor does not put you above the law. You broke the law, and now you will pay." Marie knew there would be no reasoning with him. His mind was made up. She had seen that look before in meetings with stubborn council members, with business owners resisting change, and even in her own life as she grew up. But this was different. It was not a political debate or a business deal. It was about survival. "Then arrest me," said Marie, lifting her chin, "but understand this, when the truth comes out, and you will be the one held accountable, not me." Her words hung in the air, heavy like storm clouds about to break. The crowd murmured in agreement. More people pushed their way to the front, demanding answers, pointing out the blatant abuse of power by the officer. Marie could feel the tide turning in her favor, and Kirkland seemed to notice it as well. His smirk faltered for an instant, his eyes darting nervously to the growing crowd. He was not used to being questioned, and especially not in public. Instead of giving in, Kirkland doubled down, tightening his grip on Marie's arm and shoving her towards the patrol car. "I need everyone to disperse now," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "Anyone who interferes will be arrested." "Arrested for what? For defending our mayor? You are the one breaking the law," shouted a young woman in the crowd. Others joined in the chorus of indignation, their voices rising like a wave crashing against the shore. Marie could feel the shift in energy, the growing anger in the air, but it was not aimed at her. But that anger was not directed at her. It was aimed squarely at Kirkland. Now she could see it in his eyes. He realized he had made a grave mistake. Yet, instead of backing down, he dug in deeper, whether out of stubbornness or blinded by his own prejudice. "You think I am afraid of a crowd?" Kirkland sneered, his voice slightly trembling. "You people need to understand how the law works, and if I have to teach you, then so be it." The words "you people" sent a fresh wave of anger through the crowd. Marie clenched her fists, feeling the cuffs bite into her wrists, but she kept her composure. Now was not the time to react emotionally. She had to think strategically, find a way to turn the situation around without escalating the violence. Then, from the back of the crowd, a familiar voice called out, "Kirkland, what the hell are you doing?" The crowd parted, revealing another police officer, this one with genuine concern etched on his face. It was Officer Daniels, one of the few in town who had earned Marie's respect. He was not like Kirkland. Daniels was known for his level-headedness and respect for the community. His arrival was like a ray of hope. "Daniels," Kirkland said, suddenly less confident, "I got this under control." She crossed against the light. She resisted. "I am just doing my job." Daniels looked at Kirkland, then at Marie, his brow furrowing. "She is the mayor, Kirkland. You know perfectly well who she is. Why are you treating her like a criminal?" "Because she is a criminal," Kirkland snapped, though his words lacked their former fire. "I told you she resisted." She is the mayor," repeated Daniels, his voice calm but firm, "and you are making a spectacle out of nothing. Let her go before this gets out of hand." Kirkland would not relent. His grip on Marie's arm tightened, his knuckles white with effort. "I am not letting her go," he insisted. "I have every right to arrest her, and that is what I am doing." Daniels stepped closer, dropping his voice to almost a whisper. "Think about what you are doing. You are arresting the mayor in front of half the town on bogus charges. This is going to blow up in your face, and you know it." Marie watched the exchange with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Daniels was trying to de-escalate, but Kirkland was stubborn, his pride and prejudice clouding his judgment. The crowd's shouts of support for Marie only pushed Kirkland deeper into his sense of righteousness. "Back off, Daniels," Kirkland warned, raising his voice again. "I got this." But Daniels would not back down. "No, you do not," he said, stepping even closer. "You are about to make the biggest mistake of your career. Let her go." For a moment, there was a tense silence. The crowd had gone quiet, their eyes locked on the two officers. Marie's heart raced. She could see the internal struggle on Kirkland's face, the need to assert dominance battling the dawning realization that he was losing control of the situation. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, Kirkland shoved Marie towards Daniels. "Fine," he spat, "take her, but do not think this is over." Daniels caught Marie, helping her steady herself. "Are you okay, Mayor?" he asked quietly, his eyes filled with concern. Marie nodded, her wrists still aching from the cuffs. "I am fine," she said, though her voice betrayed the weight of what had just happened. But this was far from over. As Daniels removed the cuffs, the crowd erupted in applause. Cheers of support rang out across the street, people chanting her name, their voices rising together in solidarity. Kirkland, defeated but still fuming, stormed back to his patrol car, his face a mask of frustration. Marie stood tall, though her hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline. She knew this was no longer just about her. It was about the town, about confronting the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Kirkland to act with impunity. And as the crowd surged forward to greet her, to offer their support, Marie understood that this was the beginning of something much bigger. The town of Meadowville had remained silent for too long. Today, that silence was broken, and the ripple effect of what had happened had only just begun to be felt. The energy of the moment had not yet faded when Marie finally stepped away from the scene. The street hummed with murmurs, phones still recording, conversations flowing, and tension lingering in the air like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Officer Daniels, who had quietly unlocked her handcuffs, stood by her side, his eyes full of unspoken words. Marie felt the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, heavier now that the immediate threat had passed. However, as she walked away from the crowd, she knew this was only the beginning. Meadowville was changing before her eyes, and what had occurred that morning was merely the spark that ignited something far greater than the unjust arrest of one woman. The clash with Officer Kirkland had struck a nerve not just in her, but in the entire community. As she walked through the familiar streets, Marie noticed how the town felt now. Every corner, every sidewalk, every business she passed seemed charged with the awareness of what had just happened. Faces she had known for years looked at her differently, now some with admiration, others with an unspoken question, now what? The incident was far from resolved. It was about to trigger a series of events that would shake the foundations of Meadowville's old order. But for Marie, the most immediate concern was not just the town's reaction, but her next step. Her mayoral duties called, and as much as she wanted to process what had happened, she had a meeting with the business council in less than an hour. Still, the gravity of what had occurred weighed on her mind. She stopped at a cafe she frequented, seeking a moment of calm before heading to her office. Inside, the familiar hum of daily life filled the space, people chatting over breakfast, baristas taking orders. Yet even here the atmosphere was different. Heads turned as soon as she walked in, and a hush fell over the room. One of the baristas, a young black woman named Janice, gave her a knowing nod. Janice had been working at this cafe since high school, and Marie had always admired her work ethic and optimism, despite the challenges she faced as a young black woman in Meadowville. Mayor Walker, said Janice softly as Marie approached the counter, "I saw what happened out there. Are you okay?" Marie managed a small, tired smile. "I am fine, Janice, just a bit shaken, I guess. How are you holding up?" Janice's eyes flickered with uncertainty, as if she wanted to say more than her words aloud. "I have been there," she finally said quietly, "not on that scale, but I have had my run-ins. It is hard to be seen, you know." Marie nodded. She knew. She had lived through the same subtleties, the same quiet discrimination, the looks of disdain that people like Kirkland wore with pride. But today had gone too far, even for this town. "You kept your composure with great strength," continued Janice. "I do not know if I could have remained so calm. People are already talking about it. You know, they are calling it heroic." Marie's stomach twisted at that word. She did not feel like a hero. Heroes were people who ran into burning buildings or saved lives. She had merely stood her ground, refusing to let Kirkland strip her of her dignity. Yet, despite her doubts, she could not deny that something important had shifted in town that day. As Janice prepared her usual order, Marie's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a flood of messages and missed calls from City Hall, her staff, and several reporters. The story had already gone viral. Clips of the arrest were spreading rapidly on social media, with headlines like "Racism in Meadowville, Mayor Marie Walker arrested," and "Meadowville's racist police force exposed" showing up in her notifications. Marie realized then that her quiet life as the mayor of a small town was over, at least for now. The world had taken notice, and with that came a new level of scrutiny, both for her and for Meadowville. The real question was how she would respond, and what she would do to ensure that something like this never happened again, not to her or to anyone else. With her coffee in hand, she stepped outside, her mind racing. The next steps were critical. As much as she wished to ignore what had happened, she could not. She had to face it, turn it into an opportunity for change, and ensure that the voice of the community was heard louder than ever. In some way, Meadowville had just awakened, and Marie Walker would have to guide it toward a more just future. Although Marie wanted to storm into City Hall and tackle the issue head-on, she knew she had to be cautious. Officer Kirkland was not just a problematic cop, he was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that had long been rooted in Meadowville. Facing that problem meant questioning not only the police, but also the power structure that had allowed someone like Kirkland to feel he could act with impunity. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was Margaret, her chief of staff. Marie hesitated before answering. She knew what Margaret would say: damage control, carefully worded statements, managing the fallout. But Marie was not interested in damage control. Right now, she wanted change. Margaret, said Marie upon answering, "What is the situation?" "Marie, we have a problem," Margaret replied. Her voice tense. "The media is going crazy, and the council is panicking. We need a statement, something that downplays the incident before it spirals out of control." Marie felt a spark of anger. Downplay softened the gravity of what had just happened. "Margaret, I am not downplaying anything. This is serious. And it is not just about me, it is about the entire town. People are angry, and they have every right to be." "I know, Marie, but you must be careful. If you push too hard, you risk alienating important people. The council is already talking about distancing themselves from the issue. We cannot afford to have the administration divided." Marie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I understand the political implications, Margaret, but I am not sweeping this under the rug. If we do not address this head-on, we are telling the people of this town that their concerns do not matter. I will not do that." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a resigned sigh. "Okay, Marie, but you know this is going to be a fight. Are you ready for that?" Marie looked out at the streets, at people going about their day, unaware of the storm that was brewing. "I have been fighting my whole life, Margaret. I am not about to stop now." She hung up and headed toward City Hall, ignoring most of the calls and messages still coming in. She knew that now, more than ever, Meadowville's eyes were on her, and she could not afford to let them down. Upon entering, she noticed the tension in the air. Her staff, usually energetic, looked somber today. Margaret awaited her at the entrance, clipboard in hand, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I have already set up a press conference," Margaret said, walking beside Marie. "The media is outside, and they are hungry for a statement. I know you want to address this, but please, Marie, just be careful. You know how things can be twisted." Marie nodded. "I will be careful, Margaret, but I am not holding back." As they approached the council chambers, Marie could hear the worried murmurs from inside. When she entered, all eyes turned to her, a mix of relief and anxiety crossing their faces. "Mayor Walker," said Tom Jenkins, a council member, standing up with his hands nervously clasped, "we have been discussing the situation, and we think it would be best if we issued a joint statement, something that reassures the public that this was all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Marie raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but laced with incredulity. "Tom, I was arrested in broad daylight for no reason. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a real problem." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "I am not disagreeing, but we must be careful about how we frame this. The police department is already feeling the heat, and we do not want to incite more division." Marie's eyes narrowed. "This is not about avoiding division, Tom. It is about addressing it. There is a real problem here, and if we do not fix it, it will get worse." The room fell silent as Marie's words hung in the air. She could see the fear in their eyes, fear of change, fear of confronting uncomfortable truths long ignored. But she was not afraid anymore. "This is not just about one officer making a mistake," Marie continued, her voice strong and steady. "It is about a system that allows people like Kirkland to feel invincible. It is about how this town treats people of color, and I will not be silent about it any longer." From a corner, Margaret watched, her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and concern. Marie knew she was taking a risk by speaking so boldly, but it was a risk she had to take. The time for silence was over. Just after finishing speaking, the door to the council chambers opened, and one of her aides stepped in. "Mayor Walker, the press is ready for you." Marie nodded, straightening her blazer. This was at the moment she would take a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice in this town. With Margaret by her side, and the council watching her every move, Marie walked out to face the cameras, knowing this was only the beginning of a long and difficult battle, but one she was more than ready to fight. Before the storm, the press conference was set up outside the grand steps of Meadowville City Hall. The building, with its white columns and stately appearance, had always represented the town's quiet strength. But today, the air was heavy with anticipation. A crowd had gathered, far larger than Marie expected. Residents, activists, community leaders, and of course reporters. Their cameras were aimed and ready to capture every word and expression. Marie stood behind the podium, her hands gripping the edges as she glanced at the sea of faces before her. The moment felt surreal, the culmination of years of unspoken tension finally coming to a head. The videos of her arrest had gone viral overnight, reaching not just nearby towns but national news outlets as well. Now all eyes were on her, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to lead. Behind her, the city council sat stiffly, their expressions a mix of anxiety and weariness. They had convened hastily before the press conference, some urging her to tone down her message, to avoid inflaming the situation further. But Marie had stood firm. She knew this was not a time for watered-down statements. It was a time for truth. Margaret stood beside her, a silent pillar of support. Marie could feel the weight of her chief of staff's concern, but also sensed that Margaret knew this had to be done. As much as they both wanted to protect the town from any potential fallout, they also knew the moment called for courage, not caution. Taking a deep breath, Marie stepped up to the microphone. The crowd hushed, the tension palpable. The reporters leaned forward, pens poised, and cameras zoomed in on her face. For a brief moment, all the noise, chaos, and uncertainty of the past 24 hours seemed to fade away. It was just her and the people she had been elected to serve. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady though the weight of her words seemed to hang in the air. "I stand before you today not just as your mayor, but as a resident of this town, as someone who loves Meadowville and everything it represents." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Yesterday, I was unlawfully detained by one of our police officers. I was handcuffed, humiliated, and treated like a criminal for simply crossing the street on my way to work. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a mistake. It was an act of racial profiling, plain and simple." The crowd murmured, and she could see the shift in their faces, some nodding in agreement, others showing shock. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. "For far too long," she continued, "we have allowed a culture of bias and discrimination to take root in our institutions. This is not just about one officer. It is about a system that fails its citizens, especially its Black citizens and other marginalized groups, time and again, and I will not stand by while that continues." Marie's voice grew stronger with every word, her resolve solidifying as she saw support grow in the crowd. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Though she had not realized it until now, every fight, every injustice she had faced had led her here. "As your mayor, I have worked tirelessly to build bridges in this community, to create opportunities for all, but now I see that there is much more work to do, and that work starts today." Some faces in the crowd showed hope, others skepticism. There were still those who believed that Meadowville was above these issues, that racial bias was something that happened elsewhere. But yesterday had shattered that illusion. Marie noticed the change in the atmosphere. The wounds were in plain sight, and, for the first time in a long time, the entire town was facing them head-on. Now her task would be to channel that anger, that pain, and that determination into real change. And she was ready to do it. The video of her arrest, the images of her in handcuffs, had exposed a truth that many had tried to ignore. "I am calling for an immediate investigation into the actions of Officer Kirkland and the Meadowville Police Department," declared Marie, her voice echoing across the square. "This investigation will be independent, transparent, and thorough, and we will not stop until justice is served." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. She knew this was a bold move. Demanding an independent investigation was no small feat. It would challenge the very structures that had held power in this town for decades. But Marie also knew it was necessary. Without accountability, there could be no trust. Behind her, she could sense the discomfort of the city council. Some of them had hesitated to support such a drastic measure, but Marie had made it clear that if they wanted to be on the right side of history, they would need to back her. She was not going to back down. Not now, not ever. "This investigation," she continued, "is only the first step. We need comprehensive reforms in our police department. We need to address the systemic issues that have allowed officers like Kirkland to operate without consequence, and we need to rebuild the trust between our community and law enforcement." The crowd was silent now, listening intently. Marie could see the weight of her words settling over them. This was not just about yesterday, it was about years of unspoken bias, quiet discrimination, and injustices swept under the rug. Now, they had a chance to confront it. "I know that change is not easy," Marie said, her voice softening. "I know that for many of you this feels uncomfortable, even frightening, but we cannot let fear stop us from doing what is right. This town, our town, deserves better. We deserve a future where every person, regardless of their race, is treated with dignity and respect. The reporters were scribbling furiously now, capturing every word. Cameras flashed as Marie stood tall, her message clear and unwavering. She was not just calling for reform, she was calling for a reckoning, for the town to confront its past and reshape its future. "I am not just fighting for myself," she said, her voice strong once again. "I am fighting for every person in this town who has ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who has ever felt invisible or unheard. This is our moment to come together, to stand up against injustice, and to make Meadowville a place where equality and justice truly mean something." There was a beat of silence as her words hung in the air, and then slowly the crowd erupted into applause. It started with a few claps from the front, then spread like wildfire through the square. People were cheering, chanting her name, their voices rising in unity. Marie's heart swelled with emotion as she looked out at the crowd. This was the town she had always believed in, the town she had fought to lead. And now, standing before them, she knew they were ready to fight with her. But even as the crowd cheered, Marie knew this was just the beginning. There would be backlash, there always was. Some in the town, especially those in positions of power, would resist the changes she was calling for. There would be difficult conversations, confrontations, and likely more moments of tension. But Marie also knew that this was the only path forward, that there was no going back to the way things were. When the applause died down, one of the reporters raised his hand. "Mayor Walker, do you believe Officer Kirkland will be held accountable for his actions? And how do you respond to the claims that this was an isolated incident?" Marie met the reporter's gaze, her expression resolute. "If we are truly committed to justice, then yes, Officer Kirkland will be held accountable, but this is not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger pattern, not just here in Meadowville, but across this country, and it is time we confront it head-on." Another reporter quickly jumped in. "What do you say to those who believe you are overreacting, that this is being blown out of proportion?" Marie paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I would say they should try walking in my shoes, try being arrested on your way to work, not for something you did, but for who you are, and then tell me if it is being blown out of proportion." The atmosphere grew denser, more real. The cameras kept rolling, microphones waiting for her next words. And Marie, her gaze held high, made it clear that she would not back down. If Meadowville was ready to change, she was ready to lead it. "Blown out of proportion, this is not about overreacting. It is about standing up for what is right," said Marie. The crowd cheered again, and Marie felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. This was a moment of truth not just for her, but for the entire town. And though the road ahead would be difficult, she knew she was not walking it alone. The press conference ended with the crowd dispersing slowly, still buzzing with energy. Reporters continued asking questions, but Marie stepped away, knowing she had said what needed to be said. Now it was time for action. As she walked back into City Hall, Margaret caught up with her, her eyes wide with admiration. "That was incredible, Marie. You really nailed it." Marie smiled, though the weight of the moment was still heavy on her shoulders. "Thanks, Margaret, but this is just the beginning." Margaret nodded. "I know, but you have already taken the hardest step." Marie looked around at the now empty square where just moments ago hundreds of people had stood in solidarity. Let's hope the town is ready for the steps to come. Inside, the city council was waiting for her, still processing the boldness of her statements. But Marie had no time for their concerns. There was too much work to be done. She straightened her shoulders and prepared for the next battle. Meadowville was about to change, and she was determined to lead that change, no matter what it took. The battle for reform. As the doors of City Hall closed behind her, the energy of the press conference still lingering in the air, Marie Walker knew that she had only just begun to climb a mountain. The applause from the crowd, the cheers of solidarity, had all been important, a moment of unity and hope. But what awaited her inside City Hall was the stark reality of politics, where change often moved at a glacial pace, and the forces of resistance lurked in every corner. The city council members were already seated in the conference room, their expressions ranging from nervous to outright hostile. Marie had known this was coming. It was one thing to speak boldly in front of the public, to demand justice and transparency. It was another to enact real change in the face of entrenched power. And in Meadowville, power was held tightly by those who had no interest in seeing the status quo disrupted. As Marie entered the room, the conversation quieted and all eyes turned to her. Tom Jenkins, one of the longest-serving council members and a known conservative voice, was the first to speak. "Well, Mayor," Tom began, his tone measured but tinged with frustration, "you certainly made quite a statement out there today." Marie took her seat at the head of the table, her back straight and her gaze steady. She could feel the tension in the room, thick and unyielding, but she was ready. This was where the real work began. "I said what needed to be said, Tom," she replied, keeping her voice calm but firm. "We cannot pretend that what happened yesterday was an isolated incident. The people of Meadowville deserve accountability, and they deserve a police force that serves all of them, not just some." Tom exchanged glances with a few of his colleagues, their silent communication clear they were not going to make this easy. "Look," Tom said, leaning forward slightly, "I am not saying we do not need to address the issue, but an independent investigation is a pretty drastic step. We have protocols in place for dealing with these kinds of situations. We should let the internal review process play out." Marie had expected this argument. It was the same one she had heard time and time again from those more interested in maintaining appearances than making meaningful changes. The internal review process was a joke, a way for the police department to investigate itself, and more often than not sweep misconduct under the rug. "We have seen what the internal review process produces," Tom, Marie said, her voice sharpening. "It produces nothing. The people of this town do not trust it, and they have every reason not to. If we want to restore trust, we need transparency, and independent investigation is the only way to ensure that." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was not used to being challenged so directly, especially not by Marie, who had always been known for her diplomacy. But diplomacy had its limits, and this was not a time for half measures. "I get that emotions are high right now," Tom said, his tone growing more defensive, "but we have to think about the long-term consequences of this. An independent investigation could drag on for months, even years. It could tie up resources we do not have. And what if it turns out to be inconclusive? What happens then?" Marie met his gaze, her eyes steady. "What happens if we do nothing, Tom? What happens if we let this moment pass without taking real action? The people of Meadowville no longer trust the current system. If we do nothing now, that distrust will fester, and when people lose faith in their institutions, it is real stability that becomes jeopardized." It was time to lay the cards on the table. If the council wanted to maintain its authority, it would have to face the truth. Marie was there to make sure they did. "The people of this town are demanding change," continued Marie firmly. "If we do not give it to them, they will find someone who will, and I am not just talking about the next election. I am talking about protests, boycotts, unrest. We have already seen the beginnings of that today." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Marie was not exaggerating. The energy in the town had shifted dramatically since her arrest. There was growing anger and frustration, especially among the town's Black and brown residents, who had long felt marginalized and ignored. The videos of her arrest had sparked something that could not be contained, and Marie knew that if the council failed to act, the situation could spiral out of control. Tom opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut in. "I think the mayor is right." The statement came from Councilwoman Leah Carter, one of the few people of color in local government, elected only a year ago on a platform of reform. Though she was still finding her footing, she had quickly earned a reputation as a thoughtful and determined leader. Marie turned to Leah, grateful for the support but surprised by the forcefulness of her statement. Leah had often taken a more cautious approach, preferring to build consensus before pushing for change. But today, she seemed ready to stand up and fight. "Look, I know this is not going to be easy," Leah continued, her voice steady but passionate, "but what happened to Mayor Walker is a reflection of something much bigger. It is not just about her. It is about all the people in this town who have been stopped, questioned, or harassed simply because of the color of their skin. We cannot ignore that anymore. If we do, we are complicit." Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "So what are you suggesting, Leah, that we tear the whole system down and start over?" "I am suggesting we hold people accountable," Leah shot back, "and yes, if that means we have to overhaul the system, then that is what we do, because the system is not working, not for everyone." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch, and Marie could feel the divide between council members widening. On one side were those like Tom, representing the old guard, comfortable with the way things were and viewing any challenge to the status quo as a threat. On the other side were people like Leah, ready to push for real change, even if it meant facing resistance. Marie knew she had to tread carefully. She could not afford to alienate the more conservative members of the council completely, but she also could not back down from her position. This was a delicate balancing act that required both strength and strategy. "I understand that this is a difficult conversation," Marie said, breaking the silence that had settled over the room, "but it is a conversation we need to have. If we do not address these issues now, they are only going to get worse, and we cannot afford to wait until it is too late." Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but before he could, another council member spoke up. "I think we need to listen to the mayor," said Rachel Alvarez, one of the more moderate voices on the council. "I have been hearing from my constituents all day, and they are angry. People are talking about protests, about boycotting businesses. If we do not do something, this is going to blow up." Tom's face tightened, but he said nothing. It was clear that the tide in the room was turning. Slowly but surely, Marie could see it in the faces of the council members, in the way they were shifting in their seats, weighing their options. They knew that change was coming, whether they liked it or not. Marie took a deep breath, sensing that the moment of decision was near. "I am asking you all to support the independent investigation," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I am not asking for anything radical. I am asking for transparency, for accountability. If we do this right, we can rebuild trust in our police department and in our local government. But if we do not act, we risk losing that trust forever." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Tom looked around the table, clearly trying to gauge the mood of his fellow council members, but it was clear that the momentum was shifting away from him. Finally, he sighed and leaned forward, his expression resigned. "Fine," he said, his voice grudging. "We'll support the investigation, but do not expect us to roll over on everything. Mayor, there is a lot more at stake here than just this one incident." Marie nodded, though her heart was pounding. She had won this round, but she knew that Tom was right. The fight was far from over. The independent investigation was just the beginning. There would be pushback from the police department, from conservative factions in the town, from those who saw any challenge to existing power structures as a threat. But Marie was ready. She had spent her life preparing for this fight, and now that it was here, she was not going to back down. As the meeting adjourned and the council members began to file out of the room, Marie turned to Leah, who had stayed behind. "Thank you for speaking up," Marie said, her voice sincere. "I could not have done it without you." Leah smiled, though there was a hint of exhaustion in her eyes. "We are in this together, Marie, but you know this is just the beginning, right?" Marie nodded. "I know, but we have taken the first step. That is what matters." Leah's smile widened, though it was tinged with the weight of the challenges ahead. "Then let us make sure we take the next one too." Marie watched as Leah left the room, her mind already turning to the work that lay ahead. The investigation would be grueling and the backlash would be fierce. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. The people of Meadowville were ready for change, and she was ready to lead them. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the town. But in those shadows, Marie saw something new, a flicker of light, a spark of possibility. The battle for reform had only just begun. The road to justice. The next few weeks in Meadowville were nothing short of chaotic. Marie Walker, the woman who had been the town's steady, calming leader for years, now found herself at the center of a storm. The independent investigation into the police department was officially underway, and the tension in the town was palpable. Everywhere she went, people whispered her name, debated her decisions, and speculated about what would happen next. Inside City Hall, the atmosphere had become strained. Council meetings had turned into battlegrounds, with every decision scrutinized, every move dissected by those either fighting for change or clinging to the old ways. For Marie, every day felt like a delicate balancing act, and she could feel the weight of the town's future on her shoulders. The first blow came from the police department itself. Not 2 days after the investigation had been announced, Chief Harrington, the long-standing head of the Meadowville Police Department, held a press conference of his own. He stood before the cameras, flanked by several officers including Officer Kirkland, who had become the face of the department's disgrace, and delivered a defiant statement. "Our officers are under attack," declared Chief Harrington, his voice ringing with indignation. "The men and women of the Meadowville Police Department risk their lives every day to protect this community, and now their integrity is being called into question based on one incident. I stand by my officers. This investigation is nothing more than a political stunt, driven by outside forces looking to undermine our authority." Marie watched the press conference from her office, her hands clenched into fists as the chief spoke. His words were designed to rally the department and the more conservative residents of the town, those who still believed the police could do no wrong. But what angered Marie the most was the chief's refusal to acknowledge the deeper issues at play, the systemic problems that had led to her arrest and countless other incidents that had gone unreported. The phone on her desk rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Margaret. "Did you see that?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with frustration. "I saw it," Marie replied, her jaw set. "He is doubling down, just like I expected." "They are circling the wagons," Margaret said. "Harrington is not going to let this investigation go without a fight. We are going to need more than just public support. We need to get ahead of this before they can frame the narrative." Marie sighed, leaning back in her chair. She had known this would be a fight, but the reality of it was more exhausting than she had anticipated. The police department was not just defending itself, it was actively resisting any form of accountability, and they had powerful allies. The next day, Marie found out just how far that resistance would go. She had been scheduled to meet with a group of local activists who had organized protests in support of the investigation. The meeting was set to take place at a small community center in the heart of the town's Black neighborhood, a place that had long been a hub for grassroots organizing. But when Marie arrived, she was greeted by the sight of a police blockade. Dozens of officers, including Officer Kirkland, stood at the entrance to the community center, their arms crossed, blocking the door. Marie's heart sank as she stepped out of her car. The officers did not acknowledge her as she approached, their eyes fixed straight ahead. She could feel the hostility radiating from them, a wall of silent resistance. "What is going on here?" demanded Marie, her voice carrying through the thick tension in the air. "This is a public meeting. You have no right to block access." One of the officers, a man Marie recognized as Sergeant Billings, stepped forward, his expression stony. "Mayor, we have been ordered to shut down this meeting. It is a public safety concern." "A public safety concern?" Marie's voice was incredulous. "There is no threat here. This is a peaceful meeting with community leaders." Sergeant Billings did not flinch. "We have received credible information that there could be unrest. We are here to prevent that." Marie's anger flared. She could see what was happening. This was not about public safety. This was about intimidation. The police were sending a message not just to her, but to the entire town. They were showing her and the activists that they still held the power. "I do not know what game you think you are playing," Marie said, her voice low and controlled, "but I am not going to be intimidated. These people have the right to meet, and you have no authority to stop them." Sergeant Billings' expression did not change. "I am just following orders, Mayor." Marie glared at him for a long moment, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of the other officers on her, waiting to see how she would respond. If she pushed too hard, it could escalate, but if she backed down, it would send the message that the police could act with impunity even in the face of the investigation. Before she could decide what to do next, one of the activists appeared at the entrance to the community center. It was Michael Green, a local organizer, who had been one of the loudest voices in the push for reform. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, and his expression was one of grim determination as he walked toward Marie. "Mayor Walker," Michael said, his voice calm but laced with anger, "we have got a situation. Here the people are ready to meet, but the police are blocking us." "I can see that," Marie replied, turning to face him. "I am trying to handle it." Michael glanced at the officers, his jaw tight. "This is not the first time they have tried to shut us down, but we are not going to be silenced." Marie knew Michael was right. The police were trying to stifle the growing movement for accountability, using their power to maintain control. But she also knew that any direct confrontation here, in front of cameras that were already starting to gather, could backfire. The police wanted a reason to paint the activists as violent agitators, and she was not going to give them that. "I will handle this," Marie said quietly to Michael, "but we need to keep this peaceful. If we escalate, they win. Michael's eyes flashed with frustration, but he nodded. We will stay peaceful, Mayor, but we are not backing down. Marie turned back to Sergeant Billings, her expression hardening. I am going inside, she said, and you are not going to stop me. Sergeant Billings hesitated for just a moment, his gaze flickering to the other officers. There was a brief, almost perceptible exchange of glances, as if they were weighing their options. Then, slowly, Billings stepped aside. Marie walked past him without another word, Michael by her side, as they entered the community center. The tension outside seemed to follow them, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Dozens of community members were gathered, their faces a mix of anger and determination. As Marie stepped to the front of the room, she could feel the intensity of their emotions. These were the people who had lived with the daily injustices that the police department had ignored for so long. They were tired, and they were ready for change. Marie took a deep breath before speaking. I know what you are feeling, she began, her voice steady but filled with empathy. I know you are angry. I am too. What happened out there today, what has been happening in this town for far too long, is unacceptable, but we cannot let them provoke us into something that will derail everything we have worked for. There were murmurs of agreement, but also of frustration. Michael stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension. We hear you, Mayor Walker, but the people are tired of waiting. The investigation is a start, but we need real change. We need to know that things are going to be different. Marie felt the weight of those words. They were a reminder that promises would not suffice. She would have to turn her indignation, and that of her people, into concrete actions. The road to justice would be long, but now, more than ever, she knew she was not alone. If this video has helped you connect more with yourself and inspired you on your path of growth, take action and subscribe to the Vidas da Inspiration channel to discover more stories that will fill you with motivation and hope. I would love to know your opinion, so leave a comment telling me how this story has impacted your life or what reflections it has left you. And if you believe this message can inspire someone you know, share it with your friends so they too can find inspiration and purpose in their lives.